Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to respond to Jon Krakauer's statements on Instagram about my videos. Just as a little background, it was recently announced that Krakauer is involved with a project relating to the 1924 expedition, but details about that project and Krakauer's involvement are still vague. So let's look at what Krakauer wrote. He is responding to a question about whether he has seen my videos. I've watched some of them about the 1924 and 1996 disaster. He has uncovered a number of corrections that need to be made in my book and other accounts. But most of what he says about 1924 and 1996 is demonstrably wrong. He makes many wild claims that he presents as unassailable facts. For example, he insists that Mallory and Irvin unquestionably reached the summit, that are based on faulty data and/or speculation and are easily debunked. He is guilty of what he repeatedly accuses others, including me, of doing, starting out with an agenda and then cherry-picking evidence, frequently false evidence, that proves his agenda. So I'll start with the part about the corrections that need to be made to his book. This is great news, and no doubt his publisher is thrilled at the prospect of having a 30-year anniversary edition that contains significant corrections, additions, or commentary. In addition, he seems to want to tell the story of what actually happened. At this point, he is certainly not doing it for the money, and I take this as him wanting his book to be an accurate account of what occurred on the mountain. This is in contrast to the numerous people in the comments believing that there are multiple truths and that Krakauer was merely telling his personal version of that truth. It does not appear Krakauer buys into this philosophy, but rather wants to present the climb from an objective truth about what happened. So for that part, Krakauer and I are on the same page, and I look forward to his new book, postscript, or whatever comments he has. I view his statements very positively, and I will say that it has caused me to rethink some of my beliefs about Krakauer's motivations and ego. But ultimately, I care more about what people do rather than what they say. So I'll await the actual doing before getting too excited. The one item that I would like to see covered is the reported stunt that was planned on the summit. Lena Gammelgard is still alive and perhaps willing to talk to Krakauer about the statements she made in her book. Neil Beitelman is also alive and seems to have a good relationship with Krakauer and could explain why Charlotte Fox stated she was told to wait on the summit. Unfortunately, Charlotte Fox has passed away. If some stunt was planned and the clients were supposed to wait for Scott Fisher to arrive in order to perform the stunt, that would explain the major question of why the Mountain Madness clients waited on the summit for such a long period of time. Turning to the second part of his comment, I will say that if Krakauer or anyone else were to debunk my videos, I would be thrilled because it would simply mean that we are that much closer to knowing the truth of what actually happened back in 1924. I have over 100 videos, and it is difficult to say what Krakauer feels is false evidence. I typically put the source directly in the video, and if you look at the watch times on my videos, you see that people either pause the video on a key piece of evidence or they watch that section repeatedly. This is on YouTube. It shows up as a faint graph if you mouse over the timeline. So viewers are clearly interested in the actual evidence. People are also routinely pointing out mistakes in my videos, and those corrections get made in the comments. My videos get fact-checked by thousands of viewers, many of whom are all too eager to find some minor mistake I made. Krakauer claims to have found a large number of mistakes overlooked by everyone else. So I look forward to seeing exactly what myself and thousands of other people have missed. In contrast to Krakauer's statements that my videos are easily debunked, Into Thin Air is extremely difficult to debunk. It requires extensive knowledge of high-altitude mountaineering, knowing how the Russian oxygen systems works, and you must have access to numerous different publications and photographs to cross-reference Krakauer's ever-changing story. This is not something I would expect the average reader of his book to be able to do, nor even an avid reader of 1996 disaster books. A number of people have contacted me and said that they had read everything they could about the 1996 disaster and that it was only after seeing my videos that any of it finally made sense. It is not that millions of people who read Krakauer's book are all stupid. It is that Krakauer is very, very smart, and my videos look at the sophisticated techniques he uses to convince people that something is true when it is not. Now, Krakauer claims that is just me seeing an agenda where none exist. So be it. Once he releases his revisions, hopefully we will be closer to the truth of what happened. In terms of statements made in my 1924 videos, I do not apply qualifications on every statement I make. I rely on the intelligence of the viewers to understand the context of which I am presenting the information, and I do not needlessly repeat, "It is my belief that," or "in my opinion," which could be wrong. When it comes to 1924, viewers know that I am presenting information about a historical event for which direct and indisputable evidence does not exist at this time. Qualifying every statement with a "in my opinion" would just waste people's time. As for my views on whether Mallory and Irvin reached the summit, you can read my malloryandirvin.com blog written in June 16th, 2020, where I say, "The largest problem is that the search for Irvin still focused on searching for a camera. The main search should be for rocks in the pocket. Had Mallory and Irvin made it to the summit, they would have collected rock samples, just as Norgay and Hillary did, and Mallory himself stated he intended to do. If there were no rocks in their pockets, they did not make the summit. If there were rocks in their pockets, the rocks would be analyzed to determine their high point. Rocks provide a reliable method of resolving the controversy. Even if a camera were found, the probability of developing any film to provide conclusive evidence would be remote. It is not clear how stating that if they don't have rocks in their pockets, then they didn't make the summit means they unquestionably made the summit. I have already covered the issue of the 1999 search ripping the clothing apart such that they would not have found any rocks if they existed, so I won't go over that again here. I say numerous times in my video that the failure of the 1919 to search for summit rocks prevents us from knowing whether Mallory and Irvin reached the summit. It is clear that I do not view the issue as closed, and I specifically talk about the need to search for summit rocks if Irvin's complete body is located. Now, Jon Krakauer collected summit rocks himself, and so that I'm not accused of providing false evidence, here is the exact page in his book where he says he collected summit rocks. Krakauer collected the summit rocks and stuck them in his zippered pockets. Sandy Irvin had zippered pockets on his jacket, and Mallory toured around giving lectures about collecting rock samples from the summit. Les Krakauer again accused me of providing false information that is easily debunked. Here's a screenshot from the Harvard Crimson website with a link to the full article in the description. If Irvin's full body is found and his pockets are intact enough, hopefully they search for summit rocks and don't rip his clothing apart in a desperate search for a camera. If they do find summit rocks, the mystery is solved. If the rocks are from lower down, then they did not reach the summit. Simple as that. When Norton and Somerville climbed, it was Somerville, the more junior climber, who collected the rocks. Would Irvin, who was a friend of geologist Noel Odell, collect rock samples? I would think Odell would have impressed upon Irvin his keen interest in rock samples from the summit, but we will have to wait and see. And we might not need to wait to find Irvin to be able to answer the question in the negative of whether they reached the summit. If the videos of the 1999 search are released, and it can be determined that no rocks were in George Mallory's pockets, then it would be a near certainty that they did not reach the summit. While it is unlikely these videos will ever be made public, Wade Davis was able to view them, so perhaps Krakauer will be given the same access. If they show some rocks falling out of a pocket as it is being ripped from the ground, of course, that does not mean they reach the summit. They could simply be rocks from their high point. However, if the videos allow someone to verify there were no rocks in any of Mallory's pockets, then it is extremely unlikely they reached the summit. It is not very likely that the videos are detailed enough for that, but it is worth taking a look at. And summit rocks are not the only thing that could shed light on their climb. I have identified at least one item, a note from Odell to Mallory that was found on Mallory's body but has not been made public. A piece of that note appears in this photo here, so we know it exists, just no idea about the full content or whether Mallory was using it to make notes of his own. Although the 1999 team claims a detailed inventory of the items found on Mallory was made, they have never released a copy of that inventory, much less any way of verifying items were not removed prior to the inventory being taken. If this note or any other note that has not been fully made public contains climb time notes from Mallory that were used to time his oxygen use, this could shed significant insight into what happened on their climb. Of the numerous other notes found in Mallory's pockets, only the front sides have been made public, and we have no idea if Mallory made notes on the back of any of these. There is this naive belief that everything found on Mallory was turned over to the Royal Geographic Society. This is not the case. and numerous papers found on Mallory's body are not available to researchers, and at least one of them has never been made public beyond a small piece of it accidentally appearing in a photograph. As Krakauer explores this angle of people with agendas putting out false information, the missing items and conflicting reports about exactly what was found on Mallory in 1999 will also likely be of interest. The simple fact is that Jon Krakauer's name will open doors that are not accessible to you or me. There are a number of areas that Krakauer could break through where other researchers have been turned down. Not only with the videos Wade Davis was allowed to view, but a handwritten note from Noel Odell to Tom Hosell exists that has apparently been destroyed when Hosell left it out in the sun. However, this does not mean the information is lost, just too expensive for the average person to retrieve. Krakauer undoubtedly has a larger budget, and perhaps he can have the letter restored so we can get Odell's last written version of the story. In the archives of the Alpine Club, there's a file that has gone missing. It is the one with the question mark next to it. The contents are labeled Odell's Appendix to Norton's Ninth Communique for any Odell's Story 1924. Norton's Ninth Communique is the one where Norton moves the time of the sighting to 11 a.m. and moves the altitude to the first step. Odell's initial response to this would be very interesting, but unfortunately it appears someone has taken it from the archives. Krakauer could use his contacts with other researchers to see if any of them made copies prior to its disappearance. I was there in 2023, so it disappeared sometime prior to that. There are, of course, numerous documents at the Royal Geographic Society that they do not license for the web. They do, however, license them for books. If Krakauer does decide to write a book about 1924, he could include key sections from those documents, such as the instructions on oxygen bottle caching. Also of interest is which ice axes were purchased for the 1924 expedition's Sherpas. Although Odell recalled that they had purchased some Willish ice axes, no receipts of this purchase have been found to date, and there are reasons to believe the 1924 expedition did not purchase high-end handmade ice axes for use by the Sherpas. If Krakauer can locate who the ice axes were purchased from, that could help rule out one theory of how a Willish ice axe came to be found on Mount Everest in 1933. And as Krakauer is just getting started in his research, he will undoubtedly spend significant time in the archives, and one thing he should look for is any reference to the phrase second step written by anyone prior to June 8, 1924. So far, neither myself nor anyone else has been able to locate any use of the phrase second step while Mallory was alive. That is, neither George Mallory, Sandy Irvin, nor anyone else on that expedition ever mentioned the phrase second step in a diary, note, writing, letter, report, or any other correspondence prior to June 8, 1924. It appears that the terms first step and second step were created after Mallory's death. And as Krakauer is keen on finding predetermined agendas with people providing false evidence to support, this line of research is likely a good place to look. It appears the entire first step and second step terms were just invented after Mallory's death to push Odell's sighting further down the mountain and essentially rule out any possibility of a summit, Norton's communique on the 9th being the first such example of someone providing false evidence. That is, Norton moved the time of the sighting from 12:50 p.m. to 11 a.m. and pushed its location further down the mountain, down to the first step. Krakauer is also a great technical rock climber. I would be very interested in his analysis of this area east of the couloir. Numerous photos of it exist. I would be interested in anyone explaining which part of this section of the mountain is unclimbable. I mean, you can clearly climb up to the top of the third step. Those are some climbers there, so that is obvious. This snow slope leading up to the third step looks pretty easy. There's no record of anyone ever having climbed it, but it certainly looks like you could do it. The rock slope leading up to the snow slope doesn't look too difficult either. Again, there's no record of anyone having climbed it, but it looks pretty easy. And for these lower bands, it looks like there is the possibility of breaking through the lower of these two bands east of the Great Couloir and traversing along the slabs between it and the upper band until it is possible to break through the latter. You know, exactly like Norton had mentioned. Likely, Krakauer can get access to the drone photos and provide a detailed explanation of whether he thinks Mallory could climb through that section or identify the specific obstacle or obstacles that Mallory simply could not overcome. So there's no shortage of areas to research that will add meaningfully to an understanding of what happened on the 1924 climb. No doubt Krakauer's skills as an investigative journalist will show additional lines of research, and I look forward to seeing whatever he uncovers. But where did my belief that they made the summit come from? Was it part of some predetermined agenda, as Krakauer contends? You can look back to the first videos I put out in 2017 and see the Odell's View video, which now has over 455,000 views, with the primary demographic being people suffering from insomnia. The video largely consists of different photos taken of the mountain showing the terrain around the 26,000 foot level, which is where Odell stated he was when he saw two climbers higher on the mountain. It then analyzes different views and statements to conclude that Odell most likely saw them at the third step. That Odell saw them at the third step is hardly a wild theory. Andy Politz felt it was the third step when he climbed to where Odell made his sighting. Joachim Hemlid felt it was the third step from his view at Advanced Base Camp. The 2017 video makes a rather compelling case that Mallory and Irvin were last seen at the third step, and numerous viewers agree with that assessment. If you accept that they were at the third step at 1250, then it is overwhelmingly likely they reached the summit. There's no predetermined agenda driving that. It is a simple fact of human psychology that has come to be known as summit fever. Jon Krakauer is well aware of summit fever, as he witnessed it firsthand in 1996. In fact, the adventure consultant's story should have direct resonance with Krakauer as it relates to 1924. Of the 11 Western climbers, and yes, Jon Krakauer refers to them as Western climbers himself. This is on page 73 of his book. So, of the 11 Western climbers that set out for the summit that day, 5 would turn around before they reached South Summit. Of those 5, all made it back alive. Beck Weathers was severely injured, but his situation is a little unique. Of the 6 that pressed on past South Summit, all 6 reached the summit, and 4 of those died on the descent. This is a story that has been retold countless times on Everest. People who turn around generally survive. People who push on can indeed reach the summit, but the descent is the deadliest part of all summit climbs. Is it that difficult to believe that Mallory and Irvin might have been the first victims of summit fever on Everest? The Odell's View video is by far one of my most watched videos. It is not clear how it could be debunked. The photos are clearly taken on the mountain and match with numerous other photos and videos readily available on the internet. And that is the primary difference between my videos and Krakauer's book and the other numerous Everest videos on the internet. I show the photos of exactly what I am talking about and explain why seemingly small details in those photos have some relevance to the overall story. You can see this in the 1996 disaster. The most persuasive video I have is just looking at a single photo taken by Scott Fisher and pointing out exactly what it shows. For these videos, there is nothing to debunk. People look at a photograph and they can easily see if what I'm telling them is correct or not. Nobody needs Jon Krakauer to tell them not to trust their own eyes. In terms of Krakauer's comments appearing to be overly harsh, Krakauer lashing out at his critics is just part of his old playbook. He even criticized Rob Hall's wife, Jan Arnold, claiming she had become jealous of the success of his book. Don't worry. I'll have an entire video about Jon Krakauer's constant belittlement of anyone who criticizes him. However, I would like to spend just a brief time here to promote some of Krakauer's other books. I'll start with 3 Cups of Deceit. In that book, Krakauer exposes Greg Mortensen, the co-author of a book called 3 Cups of Tea, to be a charlatan. Just as a brief background, the book 3 Cups of Tea spent several years on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction. It was co-authored by Greg Mortensen and David Oliver Raylan. Raylan is a journalist, and Wikipedia states the book is written from Raylan's perspective as a journalist interviewing and observing Mortensen. And here's what Krakauer wrote about the best-selling, supposedly nonfiction book. The first 8 chapters of 3 Cups of Tea are an intricately wrought work of fiction, presented as fact, and by no means was this an isolated act of deceit. It turns out that Mortensen's book and public statements are permeated with falsehoods. The image of Mortensen that has been created for public consumption is an artifact born of fantasy, audacity, and an apparently insatiable hunger for esteem. I applaud Krakauer's groundbreaking book of 3 Cups of Deceit, which shows that a so-called journalist and co-author of the book deliberately manipulated facts regarding Mortensen, who claimed his organization was building schools for impoverished children. Krakauer showed that the so-called reporting in 3 Cups of Tea was not objective journalism, but rather complete fiction. Krakauer deserves substantial credit because he not only exposed the racket, but he was also an early contributor to it. Krakauer had fallen for the lies of the charlatan Mortensen and had worked extensively with his charity. Longtime subscribers of this channel are well familiar with Carl Sagan's saddest lesson. One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. Krakauer appears to be one of the few people who can escape the power of the great charlatan. As he explores the 1924 expedition, hopefully he can see that there are no shortage of charlatans in this area as well. Turning to another book by Krakauer, Where Men Win Glory, The Odyssey of Pat Tillman, Krakauer writes of a, quote, broad conspiracy by the U.S. Army to cover up the circumstance of Pat Tillman's death. The Army countered that this was simply not true. It was just a series of honest mistakes. Krakauer summarized the Army's version in that it was merely a coincidence that Army personnel had falsified documents, withheld information, and violated regulations up and down the chain of command. The Army stated there was no cover-up. There was misinformed action on the part of multiple soldiers, and you had a perfect storm of mistakes by many soldiers. Of course, Krakauer did not believe that it was just a series of honest mistakes, and he outlines what he calls the broad conspiracy in more than 400 pages of his book. So when people in the comments say, oh, it looks like you just don't like Jon Krakauer, that is simply not true. It is that there are 2 Jon Krakauers, and it is my firm belief that if the Jon Krakauer that exposed the charlatan in 3 Cups of Deceit and the Jon Krakauer that documented what he himself called the broad conspiracy in Where Men Win Glory, if that Jon Krakauer took an honest look at the 1996 disaster, the 1924 expedition, and most importantly, the 1960 expedition, then that Jon Krakauer would come to the exact same conclusions I have.